Alpine Liquid Fertilizers is your full-season crop fertility specialist from start to finish. Visit alpinepfl.com for more.
This is Amber with Real Agriculture, and I'm here today with Bill Wirtz of Consumer Choice Center in Europe, and we're at Crossroads in Edmonton right now, and you just did your presentation here. So talk to us a little bit about what's going on in Europe, what some of that ag policy is looking like, and what's gone right and wrong.
Yeah, a lot of things have gone wrong, really. So we started with this farm-to-fork strategy about 5 years ago. Very ambitious policies, reducing pesticides, slashing fertilizer use, reducing land use overall, increasing organic production. And the problem was that farmers were not properly consulted, and it was the policy targets were essentially completely off. So what we dealt with is increasing prices for consumers and a situation where farmers didn't feel like they had a future for their business model. That led to major protests that I'm sure many of your viewers have seen on TV, that had a fundamental effect in the sense that people voted in accordance to what farmers thought was an important policy issue, and has overturned a lot of those regulations that were being discussed. So we're really now at the point where all the political parties pretend that they're now farmers' parties and they support the farmers and they're going to do everything to make it right. I'm skeptical, still, but we're going in a better direction in the sense that we have realized our mistakes. And I want to get that message across to audiences in Canada and everywhere else.
Right, and how many of these political parties do you think are actually now talking to farmers? Do you think that there was a real shift in that?
I think in politics, the first shift is always narrative before any practical things. So the press release will say, we're the farmers' party, before anyone has actually talked to a farmer. So I think that's a big issue, and I think it's always important for people to be careful about how narratives, pan out in politics. But I also do think that there is, some of the new staff in the European Commission, the new Agriculture Commissioner, for instance, he has a background in farming through the family. He relates to this issue much better. He's going to be a bit of a compromise kind of guy who tries to smooth things over that have gone wrong over the last few years. So essentially, you could say that we were the most ambitious people that were around in 2019 and 2020 when it comes to environmental policy and agriculture. And now we're kind of taking it easy and realizing that it takes actually more time and thought to make rules that affect a very complicated system that is farming.
Right, and how are consumers generally feeling about it? I mean, it's really hard for a lot of urban consumers. They're out, removed from the farm. Yep. How are they feeling about how the changes have been implemented and the protests?
So the protests, the polling that we can see is usually between 80 and 95% support for the farmer protests. And those specifically hit the big cities because that's where the European capitals are, where the parliament sits and so on. So a lot of sympathy for what the farmers are asking for, we're asking for, not having those tax increases in Germany, not having the slashed margins in France for the, toward the relationship between retailers and producers. So a lot of those things were achieved because there was public support for them. I think overall consumers are still confused over what the real price of food is because we also subsidize food considerably in Europe. So we need to get more clarity on sort of what the current European Commission wants us to get to in the future. So consumers are definitely not as involved as many growers are. But I think these protests, what they have also done is make people more aware of our food system and become more interested in it. Never have I read that many op-eds and editorials about farm policy as in the last 2 years. I think ultimately that's a good thing.
It really is a good thing, I think. And are there organizations that are working on looking what the actual cost of food is if we were to remove subsidies?
I don't think the computer has been built yet to figure that out. It's really complicated because what you essentially would be asking for is one is the euros that you spend. You can account for that. How much does it cost? But then, all the different variables that go into the price of food, which is that how much does it cost a farmer that 5 different pesticides were banned in the last 5 years, and there were only 2 authorized, and biocontrol is being slowly authorized for some farmers, and organic pesticides, some of them were also phased out or not being sold anymore because some of the producers are not making it anymore. Some people are biocontrolling their vineyard with a falcon. It's all of these elements of cost and what is allowed and what isn't allowed, and then on top of that, Russia-Ukraine and fertilizers and nitrogen exports from Russia that were very important for Europe now not coming through anymore. All of that plays a role. It's really hard to measure regulation up against subsidies. We would have to scale back both in order to get a better view on what the real price of food is.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. And so going into the pesticide conversation, so glyphosate is now allowed in the EU?
Still is, yeah.
It still is. Okay, so it was never fully banned.
It was never fully banned. There were countries that have tried, and usually the courts would overturn it.
Okay. And what impact has that had? What have your guys' producers been thinking about it?
So the thing is that producers ultimately are left to what the European Food Safety Authority allows in terms of new products and whether it's authorized in the EU, because it needs to be in order for them to use it. Even though there is unfortunately also illicit pesticide trade that happens where farmers buy from the black market what they're not supposed to. And that also does have health consequences, because sometimes they might buy things that were banned for a good reason and they might use it wrong, and that's why it's good to have adherence to a regulatory system if that regulatory system operates with transparency and good faith. And I think that's what we've stopped doing because it becomes political. Glyphosate is a safe compound, but we still want to ban it because it's a political consideration by some political parties. I think that's the problem. Farmers would like to prepare for it, and what they're asking for is okay, if you want to ban glyphosate, tell us what else to use.
Right, and there really isn't a lot.
Well, so neonics were banned in the EU, and then they said, oh, well, you can't use neonics anymore, you can have sulfoxaflor. And then sulfoxaflor got banned, right? And then we said, well, we don't really have an alternative right now, so let's see how it goes. And then sugar beet farmers, were almost going to go bankrupt in 2020 in France, so they said you can use neonics for 3 years, and then the court said, well, you can't actually use it. It's a whole back and forth. It's really frustrating. Every week you can have different news about what the courts say and what products ought to be used or not to be used. It's incredibly difficult to really stay on top of things, and I think a lot of farmers have become frustrated and would rather protest than have an office meeting with people who change their mind every other day.
To even just be able to keep up with what regulations are saying. And so let's go on to that trade piece. You were talking about mirroring, and
mirror clauses,
what does that look like, and what would your lessons for Canadian policymakers be on that?
So mirror clauses are essentially the EU approach to trade going forward. What it says is that if your regulation needs to mirror ours in order for you to trade properly with us. So if we ban neonics, you have to ban neonics if you want to sell to us. And you have to prove to us that what you export to us did not use neonics. So that essentially we're exporting our regulatory system abroad.
Right.
Essentially, in order to trade with Europe, you have to become Europe. And I don't think that's compatible with WTO rules and how trade should work. And what it takes is for the Canadian government to push back and say, hey, we're calling you out your BS here because this is not what the rules are. We already have an agreement. It's called CETA. It took many years, and still not all countries have ratified it in Europe. But if we want trade, we need to do it on the assumption that we're both equal partners, and that yes, we produce in our ways and you produce in your ways, and that's fine. And if we buy those products with the premises made that they're from that market, that should be okay. As a consumer, I get to choose.
Right. If
so
you can label it from certain countries.
It says made in Canada. If I think that Canada is completely wrong about the way it handles food, I don't have to buy it.
Right.
I have plenty of choices in Europe myself, but I want to have more choices in the supermarket. And I want the Canadian maple syrup, not the French one.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what would you say to farmers that are looking to do something? They aren't happy with trade, and the protests in Europe are working. What would you say to Canadian farmers? Because I feel like we're not quite at that point yet.
Yeah, and different countries have different protest cultures also, right? So I don't want to prescribe necessarily what Canadian farmers ought to do and how they should protest, but you need to do something to create visibility. And yes, conferences are great, having media outlets is great, but there's only so far you can go with that. Once every decade you get a very charismatic person from that profession that is able to go on TV and really explain this well to an audience. But you might not necessarily have that here, so what you need to do is stunts. And some of the environmental organizations I was talking about in my talk that have been on the forefront of trying to ban GMOs and pesticide and think that all farmers are evil that are poisoning the consumers. They have been very good at this. You know, they dress up as a piece of corn, and they do a little protest, a little spiel in front of Parliament. They get a lot of press. They get all the cameras on them. It's good to figure out sort of how do we catch the eyeball, how do we catch the attention of the audience, and then bring the narrative to where we want it to be. Politics is all about narrative building, and if nobody does it, the politicians do it by themselves, and that's never a good idea.
Not a good idea, no, for sure. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking your time out and chatting with me, and that was Bill Wirtz on Real Agriculture.